Welcome, friends, to Midnight Lullabies. Tonight's story is from Weird Tales, Volume 1, Issue 1, March 1923. The Dead Man's Tale by Willard E. Hawkins. 4. Winky was a pet name I had given Velma when we were children together. Louis always maintained there was no sense in it and refused to adopt it, though I frequently called her by the name in later years. And of his own volition, Louis would never have mentioned anything so convivial as a jug full of kisses. So through the weary months before he was invalided home, I worked. When he left France at the debarkation point, he still walked on crutches, but with the promise of regaining the unassisted use of his leg before very long. Throughout the voyage, I hovered near him, sharing his impatience, his longing for the one we both held dearest. Over the exquisite pain of the reunion, at which I was present, yet not present, I shall pass briefly. More beautiful than ever, more appealing with her vivid deep coloring, Velma in the flesh was a vision that stirred my longing into an intense flame. Louis limped painfully down the gangplank. When they met, she rested her head silently on his shoulder for a moment. Then, her eyes brimming with tears, assisted him with the tender solicitude of a mother to the machine she had in waiting. 2 months later, they were married. I felt the pain of this less deeply than I would have done had it not been essential to my designs. Whatever vague hope I may have had, however, of vicariously enjoying the delights of love were disappointed. I could not have explained why. I only know that something barred me from intruding upon the sacred intimacies of their life, as if a defensive wall were interposed. It was baffling, but a very present fact, against which I found it useless to rebel. I have since learned, but no matter. This had no bearing on my purpose, which hinged upon the ability I was acquiring of influencing Louis's thoughts and actions, of taking partial control of his faculties. The occupation into which he drifted, restricted in choice as he was by the stiffened leg, helped me materially. Often, after an interminable shift at the bank, he would plod home at night with brain so weary and benumbed that it was a simple matter to impress my will upon him. Each successful attempt, too, made the next one easier. The inevitable consequence was that, in time, Velma should notice his aberrations and betray concern. "Why did you say to me, when you came in last night, 'There's a blue billy goat on the stairs, I wish they'd drive him out'?" she demanded one evening. He looked down shamefacedly at the tablecloth. "I don't know what made me say it. I seemed to want to say it, and that was the only way to get it off my mind. I thought you'd take it as a joke." He shifted his shoulders as if trying to dislodge an unpleasant burden. "And was that what made you wear a necktie to bed?" she asked ironically. He nodded in affirmative. I knew it was idiotic, but the idea kept running in my mind. It seemed as if the only way I could go to sleep was to give in to it. I don't have these freaks unless I'm very tired. She said nothing more at the time. That evening she broached the subject of his looking for an opening in some less sedentary occupation, a subject to which she thereafter constantly recurred. Then came a development that surprised and excited me with its possibilities. Exhausted, drained to the last drop of his nerve force, Louis was returning late one night from the bank, following the usual month-end overtime grind. As he walked from the car line, I hovered over him, subduing his personality, forcing it under control with the effort of will I had gradually learned to direct upon him. The process can only be explained in a crude way. It was as if I contended with him, sometimes successfully, for possession of the steering wheel of the human car that he drove. Velma was waiting when we arrived. As Louis's feet sounded on the threshold of their apartment, she opened the door, caught his hands, and drew him inside. At the action, I felt inexplicably thrilled. It was as if some marvelous change had come over me. And then, as I met her gaze, I knew what the change was. I held her hands in real flesh-and-blood contact. I was looking at her with Louis's sight. 5. The shock of it cost me what I had gained. Shaken from my poise, I felt the personality I had subdued regain its sway. The next moment, Lewis was staring at Velma in bewilderment. Her eyes were filled with alarm. You frightened me," she gasped, withdrawing her hands, which I had all but crushed. "Lewis, dear, don't ever look at me again like that." I can imagine the devouring intensity of gaze that had blazed forth from the features in that brief moment when they were mine. From this time, my plans quickly took form. 2 modes of action presented themselves. The first and more alluring, however, I was forced to abandon. It was none other than the wild dream of acquiring exclusive possession of Lewis's body, of forcing him down, out, and into the secondary place I had occupied. Despite the progress I had made, this proved inexpressibly difficult. For one thing, there seemed an affinity between Lewis's body and his personality, which forced me out when he was moderately rested. This bond I might have weakened, but there were other factors. One was the growing conviction on his part that something was radically wrong. With a faculty I had discovered of putting myself en rapport with him and reading his thoughts, I knew that at times he feared that he was going insane. I once had the experience of accompanying him to an alienist, and there, like the proverbial fly on the wall, overhearing learned scientific names applied to my efforts. The alienist spoke of dual personality, amnesia, and the subconscious mind, while I laughed in my, shall I say, ghostly sleeve. But he advised Lewis to seek complete rest and, if possible, to go into the country to build up physically, which was what I desired most to prevent. I could not play Mr. Hyde to his Dr. Jekyll if Lewis maintained his normal virility. Velma's fears, too, I knew were growing more acute. As insistently as she could without betraying too openly her alarm, she pressed him to give up the bank position and seek work in the open air, work that would prove less devitalizing to a person of his peculiar temperament. One of the results of debility from overwork is, apparently, that it deprives the victim of his initiative, makes him fearful of giving up his hold upon the meager means of sustenance that he has, lest he be unable to grasp another. Lewis was in debt, earning scarcely enough for their living expenses, too proud to let Velma help as she longed to do, his game leg putting him at a disadvantage in the industrial field. In fact, he was in just the predicament I desired, but I knew that in time her wishes would prevail. The circumstances, however, that deprived me of all hope of completely usurping his place was this. I could not, for any length of time, face the gaze of Velma's eyes. The personified truth, the purity that dwelt in them, seemed to dissolve my power, to beat me back into the secondary relationship I had come to occupy toward Lewis. He was sometimes tempted to tell her, "You give me my one grip on sanity." I have witnessed his panic at the thought of losing her, at the thought that some day she might give him up in disgust at his aberrations, and abandon him to the formless thing that haunted him. Curious to be of the world and yet not of it, to enjoy a perspective that reveals a hidden side of effects, which seems so mysterious from the material side of the veil. But I would gladly have given all of the advantages of my disembodied state for 1 hour of flesh and blood companionship with Velma. My alternative plan was this. If I could not enter her world, what was to prevent me from bringing Velma into mine? 6. Daring? To be sure. Unversed as I was in the laws that govern this mystery of passing from the physical into another state of existence, I could only hope that the plan would work. It might, and that was enough for me. I took a gambler's chance. By risking all, I might gain all. Might gain. The thought of what I might gain transported me to a heaven of pain and ecstasy. Velma and I, in a world apart, a world of our own, free from the sordid travails that mar the perfection of the rosiest earth existence. Velma and I, together through all eternity. This much reason I had for hoping. I observed that other persons passed through the change called death, and that some entered a state of being in which I was conscious of them, and they of me. Uninteresting creatures they were, almost wholly preoccupied with their former earth interests, but they were as much in the world as I had been in the world of Velma and Lewis before that fragment of shrapnel ruled me out of the game. A few, it was true, on passing from their physical habitations, seemed to emerge into a sphere to which I could not follow. This troubled me. Velma might do likewise. Yet I refused to admit the probability, refused to consider the possible failure of my plan. The very intensity of my longing would draw her to me. The gulf that separated us was spanned by the grave. Once Velma had crossed to my side of the abyss, there would be no going back to Lewis. Yet I was cunning. She must not come to me with overpowering regrets that would cause her to hover about Lewis as I now hovered about her. If I could inspire her with horror and loathing for him, if only I could. As a preliminary step, I must induce Lewis to buy the instrument with which my purpose was to be accomplished. This was not easy, for on nights when he left the bank during shopping hours, he was sufficiently vigorous to resist my will. I could work only through suggestion. In a pawnshop window that he passed daily, I had noticed a revolver prominently displayed. My whole effort was concentrated upon bringing this to his attention. The second night, he glanced at the revolver, but did not stop. 3 nights later, drawn by a fascination for which he could not have accounted, he paused and looked at it for several minutes, fighting an urge that seemed to command, "Step in and buy, buy, buy." When, a few evenings later, he arrived home with a revolver and a box of cartridges that the pawnbroker had included in the sale, he put them hastily out of sight in a drawer of his desk. He said nothing about his purchase, but the next day Velma came across the weapon and questioned him regarding it. Visibly confused, he replied, "Oh, I thought we might need something of the sort. Saw it in a window, and the notion of having it sort of took hold of me. There's been a lot of housebreaking lately, and it's just as well to be prepared." And now, with impatience, I waited for the opportunity to stage my denouement. It came, naturally, at the end of the month, when Lewis, after a prolonged day's work, returned home soon after midnight, his brain benumbed with poring over interminable columns of figures. When his feet ascended the stairs to his apartment, it was not his faculties that directed him, but mine, cunning, alert, aflame with deadly purpose. Never was more weird preliminary to a murder, the entering, in guise of a dear familiar form, of a fiend incarnate, intent upon destroying the flower of the home. I speak of a fiend incarnate, even though I was that fiend, for I did not enter Lewis's body in full expression of my faculties. Taking up physical life, my recollections of existence as a spirit entity was always shadowy. I carried through the dominating impulses that had actuated me on entering the body, but scarcely more. And the impulse I had carried through the night was the impulse to kill.